Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the rise of religious warfare, right? We're going to take a very short amount of time in this flip to talk about something really, really confusing, right? So we are actually only talking about this stuff in this flip this one time for about 15-ish minutes or so. I'm even going to turn my timer on because I don't want people getting confused, okay? After our last flip and stuff like that, when Molly White so bravely admitted, she's like, look, Mr. Terry, a lot of that stuff was kind of confusing. I was like, you know what? I'm going to make this next flip nice and short so we can focus in on what's going on, right? But basically what we're dealing with at this point is the waves of the Protestant Reformation are now actually crashing into the shores of Catholic Europe, and it's going to lead to some warfare, right? It's going to lead to some warfare, some religious violence, and it's actually going to cataclysmically peak at this thing called the 30 Years' War that we'll talk about in class, right? Because we're going to have to play around with that timeline again a little bit. We're going to have to jump forward, and then we're going to jump backward, and then we're going to... So look, going into it, though, you need to understand, okay, is that we left off in class talking about these people known as the Huguenots, right? The Huguenots, or Huguenots, if you want to call them that as well, because it kind of sounds like astronaut, but it's not. So like now, but the big thing about it, though, is what they are is they're French Calvinists, right? If they're French Calvinists, it means that they're a type of Protestant, right? Okay, so you've got Protestantism on the rise in France, right? Now, what we did leave off talking about, though, is that we usually try to use the death of one of the kings of France to kind of mark our conversion rate of those Protestants, right? So these Protestants were converting at a pretty drastic rate, right? These French Calvinists occupied about 1 out of every 10 people in France, which doesn't feel like a lot, right? But at the death of Henry II, son of Francis I, right? The same guy that signed the Concordat of Bologna in 1516 that actually kept France from going super Protestant, right? That same guy that actually was going to try and find John Calvin and kill him after the affair of the placards and stuff like that, which is why he subsequently ran away to Switzerland. That dude's son, Henry II, got a splinter to the eye from a jousting match and died. And when he died, we were sitting at about 1/10 or 10% of the French population is going Huguenot, or about 50% of their nobility, which is a little scary. So now, why is 50% of the nobility converted, right? Now, that's a little bit of a drastic number, right? When you look at the total population, it's only 10%. When you look at the total population of the nobility, it's 50, right? So what we're beginning to see in France is particularly that religion and politics are starting to get a little wishy-washy and mixed up, right? Because what you're now seeing is that some of these nobles are converting to Protestantism so they can actually maybe not listen to the king, right? Because Calvinism does denote certain ideas that if the king does not abide by the ideas of your faith, then you are allowed to not actually listen to them, right? So this is a really, really big moment, an influx point or a juncture in European history where you're seeing politics and religion really meet head on, right? So the thing you have to understand, though, is that after Henry dies and 50% of his nobles have now converted to being Protestant, Henry had several sons, but all of them would be pretty weak, right? Francis II, who was the one that married Mary, Queen of Scots, and died at the age of 16, right? Charles IX, who's going to be so weak that his mommy has to rule for him. And then Henry III, who ends up just getting stabbed to death a little bit later on, but more on that in a little bit, right? Going into it, what you need to understand is the person that was really in control while those 3 young men were in power, and who was basically the main lady behind these French wars of religion, right? Or the one who was in power anyway. And she is an ice queen in the biggest way because her name is Catherine de' Medici. I know! The same Medici family from Florence, old girl is one of them, right? She got married into the French royal crown. It's why the Medici royal family crest has that little blue ball at the top with the fleur-de-lis on it, because that was when she got married into the French royals, right? So the thing you need to understand about it, though, is what her job was after her husband had died. She became what is known as a queen regent, which is a fun little term that you're going to need to get used to, all right? Because we're going to talk about a lot of those people during our next unit when we get into absolutism, right? But what a queen regent does is she rules for their son when they're too young, right? Or like they rule for their child if they're too young, and they also become their chief advisor when they do come of age, right? The thing you need to understand, though, is that under her reign, French nobles were converting to Huguenotism or becoming Huguenots for political and anti-monarchical reasons. That's why you had 50% of the nobility converting over already, right? And this is going to lead to some early iconoclasms and early massacres, right? So basically something that you need to understand is that in Catherine's back pocket, right, there's this family that's super, super wealthy and very prominent in France during this time period. And they're known as the Guise family, right? Guise, the Guise family, right? And the Guise family would be the next ones to probably take over should something happen to Catherine and the sons of the Valois kings, right? Because the last three Valois, you just saw them, right? They are the Valois family, right? Catherine de' Medici married into the Valois family, right? So the thing that you need to understand, though, is that these Guise individuals, right? The Guise family in France is extremely Catholic, right? The Duke of Guise is very, very Catholic. Their entire sons are all very, very Catholic. And it's going to really, really make them upset when they find out that these nobles are converting for political power, right? And it's going to lead to some early massacres, right? Because something that you have to understand is that these Calvinists, right, these Huguenots were perpetrating these things known as iconoclasms, right? Now, what that means is really, really important, okay? Because you could argue that the Protestants started it, right? So now, iconoclasms and what they are is basically the burning and destroying of religious relics, right? So Calvinists in particular believed that images of Christ and images, or not images of Christ, but images of saints, anybody that's not Christ or Mary should not have altar pieces of themselves. They shouldn't have imagery in the church. They shouldn't have their faces displayed and stuff like that. That the only images in the church that should be held up in par with Christ when the strict reading of the Bible is just Christ himself, okay? And so the idea is that basically a lot of the Calvinists thought that these saints were being prophesized as almost God-like, violating some of the early commandments, right? And so the Calvinists were very, very famous for going into some of these Catholic churches and ripping down pieces like statues of saints, or knocking the stone faces off of them and stuff like that, and basically destroying kind of icons inside the church, right? Well, this angers the Guise family, right, and leads to an early massacre. One of the massacres is known as the massacres of, I believe it's Versailles. But like basically, they were running into Huguenot churches while they were in mass and killing huge numbers of them, right? And that was known as the First French War of Religion. These iconoclasts, okay, and many other things led to the very first armed conflict and public executions of Huguenots by the Guise family. This is referred to as that First French War of Religion. And there were subsequently 6 more of them, right? There were 7 total French Wars of Religion, right? And France would have 2 subsequent small ones, mostly due to the fact that the sons were very, very weak and stuff like that. But the first through the third were mainly being handled by Catherine de' Medici herself, right? Like French War of Religion 1, 2, and 3 was basically just Catherine de' Medici, her weak sons, and the Guise family fighting against these Huguenot nobles, right? Now, the largest results of these early, like, French Wars of Religion were stalemates, which means basically, like, no one's winning and stuff, and just people are dying in decently sized numbers. Several French cities are also going to end up converting completely to Protestantism and being basically, like, coined as a Protestant city. For example, La Rochelle, which is a little bit, I have stars next to it and stuff like that, because they're going to come up a little bit later on, right? Because the fact that La Rochelle is a Protestant city in France is going to be a little bit of an important piece of a story when we talk about Charles I and this other guy named the Duke of Buckingham. Right? So like now when we talk about England and their involvement in Protestantism and the growth of Protestantism in France. So going into it, you also have to understand other cities like Cognac and Montauban, they're also going to convert to Protestantism also. And so going into it, what you need to understand is like that's your biggest results of the first to the third like wars. But another thing that's happening as well is something you can add on to that first result is it's stifling the French economy, right? France is not making as much money as they should be making through their exploratory conquests or their colonization period. It's actually stifling a lot of that. And so Catherine's got an issue on her hands, and she wants these wars to stop, okay? So, like, something you need to understand is that Catherine de' Medici wants to bring these wars to an end, and to help stop that violence, she comes up with a plan. She has very weak sons, and at the time when the event that we're about to talk about happens, her son Charles IX was in power, right? So going into it, though, you have to understand, to help stop the violence, she wants to have a royal wedding, because she has a single daughter, right? Exactly. So, like, they want to take Margaret, okay, the single daughter, and marry her off to this person named Henry of Navarre, right? And so the plan here is to set a royal wedding between a Protestant and the Catholic, right? Now, granted, just before we go too further into this This was preceded by Catherine advocating for religious tolerance and allowing a Protestant advisor, a Huguenot advisor, to actually come back to her son and actually help him in his kingly duties. The Catholics were super upset about that, right? But she actually had tried a lot of different things, and she wanted the culminating event to bring an end to the violence to be a wedding between her daughter, Margaret Valois, to this man, Henry of Navarre, right? Henry of Navarre was a Protestant leader and basically the leader of all Protestants in France at the time, right? Now, she told him, though, she was like, look, if you're going to marry my daughter and possibly be in the royal line of lineage, which means that you could have a claim to the throne eventually, you must convert to Catholicism, right? You have to convert to Catholicism and then get your boys to calm down, right? So you got to convert to Catholicism and then you got to basically be like, hey, Protestants, this is our victory. No more war, no more fight, no more breaking up churches, right? And so Henry agrees and converts, right? And then they go and they get married. But what ends up happening is hundreds of Huguenot nobles show up to this wedding because they feel as though this is a victory for them. And subsequently, right after, is this thing called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Because if you are Catherine de' Medici, why would you pick the big fat wedding to be the moment when you would actually kill all of them because they're all in one spot, right? And the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre happened 3 days after the wedding of these two individuals, right? After Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre married each other, what ends up happening is basically after a failed assassination attempt, right? Margaret Valois and Charles IX order the execution of all Protestants within the walls of Paris, right? So they lock the doors to Paris because literally at the time, Paris had a huge wall around it and stuff like that and gates of entry. So they locked those gates and stuff like that and they started killing people in mass, right? They ordered this entire thing and the people of Paris mobbed, egged on by the Guise family, right? The Guise was like, get them! And they murdered Protestants all throughout the city. And apparently the massacre itself spread even beyond the walls of Paris. And there's some estimates that say that 70,000 people died during the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572. 3,000 of them might be the low number. The high number might be the actual 70,000 number. And you can actually see right here a weak Charles IX standing in the background while his mother is up front, Catherine de' Medici, and looking over the bodies of all of these dead Protestants, right? And then you also have this famous picture as well with Catherine de' Medici, Where's Waldo in the back, counting all of these dead Protestants as well. You've got Protestants being hucked out windows and stuff like that, which is in one of the earliest attempts of actually killing Charles IX's advisor and stuff like that, right? So, but what ends up happening and going down, though, is that Henry of Navarre feels like, what the front door? He just killed all my friends. And he unconverts from Catholicism and goes back to being a Protestant. And after that, religious wars would rage for 15 years throughout France, right? The 4th through the 7th wars, what raged on between Henry of Navarre and his Protestant nobles and the Guise family and their Catholics, right? Now, what does end up happening eventually, though, is Catherine de' Medici does end up dying midway through all these things, right? Just from old age and complications of old age and stuff like that. But going into it, what ends up happening is her son, Henry, comes to power. And the 7th French War of Religion was known as the War of the Three Henrys because it literally had 3 different Henrys fighting over the crown of France, right? You had Henry of Guise, Henry III, the son of Catherine de' Medici, and then you had Henry of Navarre, all fighting each other for the crown itself, because Henry III wanted to bring peaceful negotiations between the two. Henry of Guise was the uber Catholic, and he was like, we ain't having that crap. And then we've got Henry of Navarre, who's the uber Protestant, who's also saying, we ain't having that crap, right? But what does end up happening, though, is Henry of Guise ends up getting stabbed to death, right? And then Henry III also gets stabbed to death as well by a crazy Catholic fanatical priest, right? So 2 of the 3 Henrys died, which left just the one Henry, right? Henry of Navarre, who would later become Henry IV, right? Death of Henry III, once that occurs, is Henry of Navarre is still now married to his sister Margaret, and because of that, he has a claim to the throne, right? But what he does is he converts to Catholicism again, and he has a very famous quote when he does this, and he says, Paris is worth a mass, right? And he's basically saying, I don't care about what mass I go to, because being a ruler and being the king of France in Paris is more worth being Catholic than it is to keep fighting as a Protestant, right? And so he converts to converts to Catholicism, and he then signs and creates a document, which is huge, right? This document that he writes is called the Edict of Nantes, right? And the Edict of Nantes gave freedom from persecution to Huguenots and other Protestants. In 1598, at the end of the summation of the War of the Three Henries, when Henry of Navarre becomes Henry IV, we'll draw all of this in class so you can get a little bit of a better grip on it. Basically what he does is he writes the very first document in France, for sure. Not in like Europe in total, because in the Holy Roman Empire, the Peace of Augsburg has already been written and is actually given, like, allowing religious practice to Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire. But in France, now you are allowed to be Protestant and be free from judgment and persecution, and be free from being massacred by the Guise family, and being free from all of this violence, right? And so this means that the ideas of religious hegemony, Miley, is now going down the drain. And that a lot of these different like leaders and kings and queens are realizing that by allowing religious plurality is a better path to actual peace, right? And this is also going to help lead to the road of absolutism, right? Now that right there is Henry, who becomes Henry IV, and this is him as dressed as Hercules slaying the Hydra, and the Hydra is supposed to be the Guise family and the Catholics and the Catholic League themselves in that painting. But later on, what happens is since he's not a Valois, the Bourbon family rises up, and that man right there is the grandfather to Louis XIV, the biggest absolutist you'll ever see, right? And then another example of a war that broke out in Europe as well was called the 80 Years' War, which lasted from 1568 to 1648 between the Dutch and the Spanish Habsburgs. Remember when we talked about how Elizabeth allied with the Dutch that were revolting against the Spanish? This is that war, right? And it's mostly due to the fact that the Dutch had converted to Protestantism, Calvinism particularly, right? They had also begun being Dutch Calvinists, right? And they actually wanted a free country of their own, so they could start trade negotiations on their own, have an economy of their own. Later on, they would start their Dutch East India Company during this entire process while they're revolting against Spain. And in that whole thing, what you have to understand is they end up being successful, and they separate themselves from Spain, and they kick Philip II and his rulership out. The same Philip II that launched a bunch of boats at Elizabeth during the Spanish Armada. But what is going to end up happening, though, is this war itself is going to be morphed together with another one called the 30 Years' War. But we'll talk about that in class because I want to stop it here so things don't get too confusing, okay? So if you have any big questions from this flip and stuff like that, just write them down for me real quick and be like, okay, wait, I don't get who goes where. Write them down for me, and we'll discuss them in class, all right? But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.